Good morning. I'm so glad to be here with you. I loved the storm last night. We had our windows open. We had flooding in our backyard. It was wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. You hear people say, well, Christians certainly aren't perfect. Well, that knowledge we already have. Already figured that one out, right? And in fact, it's because of that we know that's why we came to be Christians. Or you hear people say, churches aren't filled with perfect people. Well, we know that too. That's why we're here. Our imperfection has driven us here, right? And sometimes I've heard people say, I would never go to church because it's full of hypocrites. My thought is always, I don't always say it, but my thought is always, well, come on, we can always use another one. Because everybody in the world has been hypocritical at some point, right? And we're willing to admit it. We know our faults, and you see, most people have this idea that religion is just for good people. And the reality is it's for bad people who know just how bad they are. And that's why they come to God. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 9 today, starting in verse 9. As Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth. He said to him, "Follow me." And he rose and followed him. And as Jesus reclined at the table in the house, behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" When he heard it, he said, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. For I came to call the righteous, not to call the righteous, but sinners." As Jesus is walking from point A to point B, he sees a man named Matthew sitting at a tax booth, and he says, "Follow me." And he rose and followed him. Why did Jesus come into the world? Jesus came into the world, he says clearly, he came into the world to call sinners. Those who know they have a terminal disease called sin. Those who are desperate, those who are hurting, those who are hungry, those who are thirsty, those who are weak, those who are weary, broken, whose lives are shattered. Sinners who know they're sinners. Paul summed it up really well in 1 Timothy for all of us. He said, "Here's a trustworthy saying that deserves full acceptance. Jesus Christ came into the world to do what? To save sinners, of whom I am the worst." I think Paul had in mind, among other things, the words that Jesus has said here in Matthew, that he came to call sinners. And if you hear nothing else today, you need to know that Jesus came to call sinners. That is the point of this text. Jesus came to call sinners, the point of this passage. And aren't you glad about that? Because if he came only for the righteous, there wouldn't be anybody in the kingdom. Because none is righteous, no, not one. And if you think that you are righteous because of how long you've been a Christian, spoiler alert, you ain't. Jesus has just calmed the sea. He has just expelled a bunch of demons. He's just forgiven a man's sin. He forgave that man's sin totally and completely and comprehensively. And now we see the response to those actions. And the response is divided. There's a positive response and a negative response. The positive response comes from a sinner. And the negative response comes from the ones who think that they are righteous. And I want you to know that this part of Matthew is not just Matthew saying, "I don't know what to do with these stories, so I'm just going to put them all together." It is here in this order for a reason. Verse 9 is the call of Matthew. That's the first part of the response. It's the positive one. He sees a man named Matthew at a tax office. He says, "Follow me." And the man arose and followed. Positive response. Then he enters into a dialogue with the Pharisees. Negative response. Their responses are poles apart, but they're reacting to the exact same set of miracles, the exact same set of information, the exact same stimulus set. I want you to help me see this transition, all right? Jesus has just forgiven sins. Matthew makes that point through verses 1 through 8. He has the ability to forgive sins. And now the natural question, if you live with or are someone who has like an engineering mind, the next question is, how much sin can he forgive? Whose sin can he forgive? Whose sin does he not forgive? What are the parameters? What are the extents? What are the dimensions of his forgiveness? And that's the answer we're getting here today. Get this, let me paint this picture for you. Jesus is walking along the shore with a mass of people around him, and we come to verse 9. Jesus passed forth from there. It's coming from the house where he just did the miracles. He's walking along the shore, and he sees a man named Matthew. The other Gospels call him Levi. Levi and Matthew, same person. Same person. And he sees him sitting in the tax office, and he says to him, "Follow me." And Matthew rose and followed him. Now, if you don't know anything about Matthew, you're going to learn in this passage today. Matthew was a modest man. He was truly a humble person. He reduces his entire conversation with Jesus down to one sentence, one verse, and he says absolutely nothing about himself. And the questions that come directly after the healing of the paraplegic. The first act of forgiveness are, oh yeah, he healed the paraplegic and he forgave all his sins, but how far does that forgiveness go? I mean, what kind of people can Jesus actually forgive? And in verse 9, Matthew answers that question. He says, well, he forgave me. And you say, is that significant? It's just one dude. Yeah, it is. I'm going to tell you something that might shock you. Matthew is categorically the vilest person in Capernaum. The vilest person. By all evaluations of the time, he is the most wretched sinner in the town. And that's why he uses himself as an illustration. How far does this forgiveness business go? It goes to the extreme. Matthew calls himself here what Paul is trying to take as a title, chief of sinners. And you've probably read this story before, and you're thinking, no, wait a minute, TW, he doesn't say that here. I don't see that in this verse. It just says he saw a man named Matthew. Yeah, but you got to know about Matthew. It tells you a little bit about him, right? It says that he's sitting in the tax office. And it's easy for us to say tax people are terrible. You're probably thinking, oh, my brother-in-law's at IRS, so I understand what you're saying. But that's not what this is. The treasurer at the church we were at before here worked for the IRS. He didn't like it when we told this story. But this is a different type of tax collector. Matthew is a classic story of the Lord's ability to forgive, the Lord's power to forgive any sin. When Rome took over the area of Palestine, they needed taxes. And so anyone living in that area could buy a franchise, a tax franchise. What that means is you pay money to the Roman government, and it gives you the right to operate on their behalf the taxation system in a certain district or a certain town or whatever else. So when Matthew bought into the Roman system, he revealed himself as a traitor to the cause of Israel. Now, to a Jew, there's nothing worse, there's nothing more heinous than being anti-nationalistic, anti-Jewish. To hire on to help the oppressive conqueror who has your people in his grasp would be incomprehensible to the Jewish mind. And he bought a franchise from Rome. And Rome required that he collect a certain amount of taxes, and anything he could get over that certain amount, he got to keep. The Roman government, in order to keep him happy, to keep him on their side, that they supported him in his excesses and his abuses. So when he did overcharge, there was absolutely nothing you could do about it. Not a thing, because the Romans were behind him. So this is gross oppression. This is abuse. He only had to pay Rome a certain amount of money, and anything else he could keep. Tax collectors took bribes from the rich. They extorted the middle class and the poor. They were hated. They were despised for their lack of nationalism. They were considered traitors of the worst kind. They'd entered into the service of the country's conqueror. They were amassing fortunes at the expense of their countrymen. They were hated. Matthew was hated. But it's even worse than that. Religiously, one renowned scholar said, if you were a tax collector in this day, you could not attend the synagogue. You were barred from the place. You couldn't even have religious interactivity with the people. You were listed, and get this, in a list with unclean beasts out of the Old Testament. You were like a pig. They were forbidden to be a witness in any court of law because they couldn't be believed. They were known as flagrant liars, flagrant liars. They wouldn't even allow their testimony. They were classified with robbers and murderers. And then he goes on to say that there are two classes of tax collectors. There's actually worse tax collectors than others. The not so bad ones were the general tax collectors. Their job was to take the regular taxes. There were three regular taxes. Property tax, you know what that is. You're already upset. Income tax, you're already upset about that one too. And the last one was called a registration tax. In other words, if you were alive, you got to pay a tax. That was it. And the general tax collector took those three. He took more than he needed to make his own fortune, but those were the only three he could charge. Then there was the other. The one that dealt with taxes that were different from everything we just said. His job was to collect it on everything. We've got taxes like that already. Taxes on what you buy. Taxes on the food you eat. Taxes on every time you fly an airplane. Fly in an airplane. You might fly one, I don't know. Taxes that airplanes pay when they have to land at airports. Taxes on axles and wheels on trucks when they're moving across the country. Road taxes, tolls you pay to get across a bridge. Whatever. That's what we know. The specialist tax collector was in that vein. He was able to collect tax on all import, all export, everything bought, everything sold, every road, every bridge, every harbor, every town, everything. They could invent taxes if they wanted to. They could put taxes on axles. The more axles you had, the more taxes you had to pay. We're talking about cart axles here. So it's cheaper to move things with a two-wheeled cart than a four-wheeled cart, depending on your axle numbers, right? It was cheaper to transport with a three-legged donkey than a four-legged donkey. It took more time, but you had to pay less money. Slower but cheaper. There were pedestrian taxes. It cost you money to cross a certain road. It cost you money to cross a certain bridge. Highway taxes, road taxes, market taxes. If you wanted to have a little stand in the marketplace, you got to pay the taxes. There were taxes on the ships that brought your stuff in, on the boat, on the dock for you to be able to get your stuff there. Any fish you caught, he was able to tax. He could open any package you had to see what you had in there to determine if it was something he wanted to tax. Any private communication that came to you, he was able to open to make sure that no business was going on in that letter. Unlimited power. Sound like a fun guy? That's the tax collector. You can imagine that he was despised. He was unlimited in his abuses. He was oppressive, Tax collectors were unjust. They were the ones who sat at the merging of major roads. And that's where we find Matthew. He's sitting by the north port of the Sea of Galilee, collecting taxes on everything that comes in on the port, everything that goes out from the port, everything that's traveling close, east, west. He had one of the most lucrative tax franchises that the Romans let someone have. And here he was, the tax collector for Capernaum, sitting at his table, doing his thing, and Jesus came and said to him, "Follow me," and he did. Can you imagine the gasps? We think of Matthew as a great guy, but he's the worst. He got better. And I believe Matthew was a man under conviction. You have his conversion in verse 9, and I don't believe we have all the details. You think Jesus is walking along the shore and it says to his disciples, "Follow me," and they just jump and follow him? You think they said, "I don't know what we're getting into, guys, but this feels like a cool deal"? No. Jesus had ministered and ministered and ministered and ministered all over the area. They knew who he was. They knew everything he taught, everything he did, every wonder, every sign, every miracle. They knew what he said. They knew he'd come to forgive sins. That's exactly what they were getting into, and they were ready. Their hearts are prepared. Matthew's a man under conviction, and Matthew's a man who I believe must have had some want with his heart to have forgiveness, but the religious system he was in told him there was no such thing, that he could never be saved. So Matthew wasn't up at the house hearing Jesus speak, watching him forgive sins and heal a paraplegic. He was down there in his booth getting his money because that's what he knew to do. He recognized his sin, and I believe that's why he was so fast and ready to follow. It's not even a big discussion. He doesn't say, well, Jesus, that sounds good, but I got some questions. What's this going to involve? And I got a lot of things going on here. What? No. Luke says it in his version of this. He says, Matthew forsook all. And Matthew won't say that. He's too humble. He's not going to talk about what he left. If you were a fisherman and Jesus said, drop your nets and follow me, you could follow and always go back to fishing, right? I mean, they're always going to be fishermen. We know that after the crucifixion, that's exactly what they did. But if you're a tax collector and you get up and say, goodbye, I'm leaving, the next day someone else is in your place. There is no going back. You can't have your job back. And so the price that Matthew pays here in this single verse that we read over without paying any attention sometimes is the biggest price of any of these disciples, in my opinion. He had to have hoped for forgiveness. He had to long for it. And when Jesus offered it, he ran. You know true conversions like that. When you really see someone converted and they're not fighting, they're not trying to drag their garbage from the past into their new life, they can't let go of it fast enough. That's Matthew. And I guess for Matthew, he couldn't understand why anyone wouldn't follow Jesus when he offers forgiveness. Matthew lost a career and gained a destiny. He lost material things. He gained a spiritual future. He understood the Spirit of the Lord. He knew that Jesus had come to save sinners, and he knew that he was the worst. He was unforgivable in his system, the worst person in the town. And Matthew tells us in his gospel, that's how far forgiveness goes. That's how deep it reaches. And Matthew is so overwhelmed, he decides to throw a party. He throws a banquet, and the banquet is attended by the rottenest people you could think of, because that's the only people Matthew knew. He knew crummy, wretched, rotten, vile people, because no one else would come near him. Everyone else despised him, so the only people he knew were people like himself. So this banquet has prostitutes, murderers, robbers, thieves, irreligious, godless, and ladies, clutch your pearls, tax collectors. Ridiculous. And Matthew's gospel doesn't tell us about the details of the banquet because Matthew, again, in his humility, he won't talk about it. But like so many new believers, the first thought he had when he came to Christ was, my friends got to hear about this. My friends have to hear about this. Mark 2 and Luke 5, we find that he calls this banquet in his own home. And Jesus is the honored guest. He's got this whole thing set up. And he invites the wretched, the rotten, the vile people of Capernaum. And they're all in one building. And Jesus is the honored guest. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to the disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? This is not an honest question. This is not them saying, well, explain to me why he's doing this. Can you let us in on the secret here? What's going on? No, what they're saying is a stinging rebuke of Jesus. He's venting. They're venting out of bitterness. Shame on you. You are fraternizing with a master or a teacher that hangs around with this riffraff. That's the second time I've used that word in my life. First one was first service. This is a vindictive attitude. It's a hateful, truly religious, pious people, righteous men like we are. We shun those vile sinners. That's what they're saying. Does that sound familiar? There are a lot of people in this church, a lot of people in the kingdom, a lot of people in this room right now who would hate to admit it, but that's how they act. Your world begins and ends with people who are in the Christian family. And all we do is stand outside and criticize the ones who are out. Stand on the outside, criticize those that are in the world. We don't reach out to them. We don't help them. And if that's you, you need to think twice about that. Think twice about that. Non-Christians who are not living according to what Jesus asks of his followers don't need your criticism. They need your help. They need your love. And it blows my mind. It is wild to think that, to have the attitude that non-Christians should live by the same standards, morally, ethically, whatever else, as Christians. If you think non-Christians should live like you do as a Christian, it's just a moral statement and has nothing to do with Jesus. Paul even said that that's ridiculous. I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people, not at all meaning the sexually immoral of this world, or the greedy, and swindlers, or idolaters, since then you would need to go out of the world. They don't need to be kept at a distance. They need your mercy. They need your love. Jesus overheard this conversation, apparently. But when he heard it, he said, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, for I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. The analogy is simple. A physician can be expected to go amongst the sick people. And so a forgiver should be expected to go amongst sinful people. His defense is simple. He went to the people who had the deepest need. And in the eyes of the Pharisees, get this, in the eyes of the Pharisees, Jesus is saying, if you are so perceptive to see these people as sinners, which they are, if your diagnosis is so accurate, where is your compassion? Where is your concern? Are you a doctor who diagnoses and has no desire to cure? What an indictment of self-righteousness. What an indictment of their judgmental spirit. What an indictment of their condemning attitude. These pious critics who so freely have defined all these people as sinners, but are indifferent about these people. And the same's true with us. We say, oh, so-and-so is a terrible sinner. Or we stand on our porch and say, them neighbors of mine, they're awful people. Just sinful. You wash your hands of those sinners. And the question is, do you actually care, or you just want to say that they're not as good as you think you are? Is there mercy? That's the question. That's the issue. Jesus is saying, I didn't come to invite people who are so self-satisfied that they are convinced of their own righteousness, that they're convinced they don't need anyone's help. I've come to invite people who are desperate, who are conscious of their sin and need a Savior. The Pharisees and the scribes would have made lousy doctors. They were more concerned with their own holiness than helping someone else. It'd be like a doctor saying, I'd love to come over and cure you, but I'm not trying to get sick. Or, I will certainly give you a diagnosis, but I don't have time to bother with a cure. Would you want to go to a doctor like that? Sometimes it feels like that on the telemed things. You see, the kingdom of God is for the hungry. It's for the thirsty. They shall be filled. The kingdom is for the hurting and the mourning and the meek and the sinful. And that's what Matthew's saying. He knew it. He arose. He followed Jesus. And the rest is glorious history, isn't it? Matthew became an apostle of God who penned this incomparable gospel and entered into a spiritual inheritance that goes on forever. Jesus receives sinners. Matthew was the tax collector of Capernaum. Ew. Ew. But there are people in this church, there are people in this building, in this room right now, who have done some awful things. Some terrible things. Things that you would probably consider them to be the dregs of society. And those are exactly the people that Jesus came to save. That's the message of this passage. Jesus saves sinners. I am one of them. And I hope that you know that you are too. Because if you do, take hope in the fact that you are within range of the great physician. Amen.